Welcome back, venturers. It's time for another discussion about VN. I am Emar, and together with Tauros, we talk about destiny, a prophetic tale of a future set to pass. It's a narrative device propelling forward quite a bit of stories. Tauros, I see the signs, I hear the voices. How do you feel knowing that your fortune has reading Evenical in it?
Ooh, that is me in the crystal ball with a warning of the terrible fate to befall you in the future. Evanico will never get another sequel.
No. Don't say it like that. Let me hope.
No, you've had your fun. Now you must accept your fate and suffer.
No.
No. But yes, this is a classical conflict in all sorts of literary tales, including visual novels, of man versus fate. Classical conflict structure where the main character is fighting against fate, a prophecy, some sort of future supposedly set in stone, and the problems that that causes for the main character. And it's a lot of different aspects to it that make this such a rich, interesting central conflict for a story. The typical example of it is that early in a story, the main character learns about this fate in store for him, whether it's predicted from as in a prophecy, whether an evil witch curses him with some sort of fate, or any other, godly powers imposing this future on the character. And the rest of the conflict, or the rest of the plot, is spent fighting that fate. The main draw of the entire story is for us, the reader, to see that tease of whether or not this main character is going to break this supposedly unbreakable future. And it builds, and eventually we get to the climax, some sort of breaking point where either that dreaded future, that dreaded prophecy comes to pass, or if things have somehow been resolved differently. I really like it because it provides the basics, we get to know who the characters are, and we get to know the endpoint. We get to know where things are building up towards, whether it's enjoyed or not, and how far we can go off the rails, or how long the main character can play chicken as he resists against this untimely end.
Yes, and in some of the stories, it could also be, how can I say, a conflict within the protagonist itself, whether or not to even start the journey. Oh, because, oh no, the path is already set. Should I even try? Right? That can be an internal struggle all in itself.
Exactly. We get that, as you mentioned, we get that nice external and internal drama. There's the main character, externally trying to fight against the outside forces, the outside plot that's imposing this on him. But there's also the internal aspects, a crisis of confidence perhaps, or we get to explore in your example of the main character just sitting and waiting for this good ending to come to pass. It could be a dive into his characterization of how involved he wants to be, or what his mindset is like.
I gotta say, while you described very neatly how the typical setup for a overcoming destiny kind of story looks like, I tend to find when it comes to books, specifically longer books, as well as VNs, because obviously we're going to talk about VNs, that have more time to cook their story, that they don't really need to start with a prophecy, but rather they can later down the line introduce that prophecy as a part of recontextualization effort. And the one example I brought that is close to my heart is Blaze. Because during the course of this wacky adventure, let's call it like that, not to spend a couple hours rehashing the story and recapping how it works, you try to piece together what is happening. How come all of those stories fight for canonicity? All the events keep on changing, as if someone is painting the world and story with a brush over and over again. And during the course of the third game in the series, one of the characters that is, for all intents and purposes, above the rules of the world, tells you a story. And it's such a neatly interwoven story that she tells, that you as a reader reflect and recontextualize everything that came to pass before and see all the pattern that matches what she is describing, as well as you will try to, or at least I did, to find any and all patterns in future events. Do they fit what has been prophesied? And it just so happens that the setup she gives is that there is a story that has a set start and a set ending. And there was another hypothetical character that was given the jurisdiction of that book to weave the story as she wants, but she didn't like the story how it ends. So she kept changing and modifying and twisting and turning. But regardless of what that author did, the story had a set beginning and had a set ending. And it is such a neat narrative device that puts into question what happened before, puts into question what will happen later, and is there any point? Damn, that one bit of the story stuck with me for a very long time.
Mm-hmm. And without going into much spoilers, yeah, how does that end? What kind of resolution do the characters get?
Yeah, without coming. So there may appear there are more people distraught by being bound by destiny, and there may or may not be more actors behind the scene trying to tear it all apart. So it is quite a story with a lot of twists and turns, and to be honest, not the easiest one to digest, given the fact that they have a propensity of introducing a lot of weird definitions and concepts. But ultimately, maybe that struggle for the destiny and for the predetermined end won't be protagonists alone. And that would be the conflict on how it will shape up to be. So it's interesting.
Mm-hmm. Especially with how complicated and complex BlazBlue lore and background details can get.
Yes, exactly. Although I have to, in a cheeky way, also point out how, from the meta point, clever it is to say, yeah, as an author and a creator of Blaze, all I need to do is have a start in my head, an ending in my hand, and then interwoven that there was a prophecy that links start with the end. And the rest I can just bullshit away in between.
It's all about the freedom to do what you in between the lines.
Exactly. True.
Exactly. Very cool. Mm-hmm. And especially when time aspects get thrown into the mix.
Oh God, it's yes, like enough with complications, okay? You've asked, and I specifically avoided, right, going into much spoilers.
Mm-hmm.
But after the final ending, after you have your goodbyes with the series, with the last entry, you sit down and think, wait a moment, is that ending that broke the prophecy truly broke the prophecy?
Mm-hmm.
And then you're like, huh?
Mm-hmm. You always leave a little bit dangling. That sequel hook right there.
Exactly. Oh no. Don't give me hope, okay?
Oh. There it is. There's that hope again. Oh.
Exactly.
Yes.
I need to be hopeful.
But I did want to mention that whole time aspect because of the one example I wanted to talk about of Love Alternative. So far, we've been talking about that conflict between man versus fate, and to a certain degree of fighting against destiny. But there can be other types of an untimely fate rather than a prophecy. It could even be, say, a medical diagnosis. If the main character has a terminal illness and only has so long to live. It could be societal expectations, is that, based on your character's station in life, they are expected to have a certain role in society. And in another case, it could be a prophecy as the result of time travel. Depending on the work and how they handle time travel, it might be a case of if you go backwards in time, you need to make sure that things turn out the way they were in your present, otherwise everything explodes and kapoo, you've ruined timelines. Who knows? So that's an interesting one here when we get into the beginning of Muv-Luv Alternative. Muv-Luv Alternative, the main character wakes up and he finds that he's at the beginning of Muv-Luv Unlimited, the prequel work. And he knows how everything went in Unlimited. He knows that it did not end as well as he wanted it to. So armed with this knowledge, he takes certain actions to try and create a better future for himself, because he knows how things are fated to go if he acts as he usually does. And so he is fighting against that fate that happened at the end of Unlimited. This is his fresh start. This is his one chance, apparently, to make a different future for him. And he is going to fight for the betterment of all humanity in this case. It's not the typical example you're thinking of, because it's not like there's an ever-present prophecy, an ending for him that he's rebelling against the whole time. In fact, it's more open-ended, kind of the inverse. He knows what the future is, and he's fighting against it pretty successfully. He does change the flow of events until a certain point. He is diving completely headfirst into new territory, and in that way, he is pretty proud of himself that life has changed. And of course, for anyone who's read Muv-Luv Alternative, there's still plenty more to go on that front.
Yeah, and I feel like this example also is very interesting from the perspective of embracing that duty of changing the events that, in the future. Because to contrast that with the previous entry, the Unlimited, in which the protagonist felt like a foreign element, tried to grow accustomed to his environment, but ultimately felt to a certain degree detached from it. But it's not the case in Alternative. He pretty much fully embraced it. I want to make it happen. I want to make the better future, and see that change, and then his struggle against what he suffered from the previous installment. That's a special journey that I remember fondly.
It is very much its own little arc inside of Muv-Luv Alternative. There are big picture, ideas. The most crystal clear one is humanity fighting for its survival against the beta. And Takeru, in his own right, goes through several character arcs, but that doesn't dampen the influence of the beginning of Muv-Luv Alternative. That he is waging his own war against fate, and once things start changing, in a sense, he wins against it. And then the rest of the interesting Muv-Luv Alternative can play out in very varied and colorful and surprising ways. Who knows how that goes?
Yeah, I really... it hits me every time I think about how impressive the character development of the Takeru is in Alternative, when he just is determined. That's the biggest differentiator between Unlimited and Alternative. He is now fully committed, fully determined, and his outlook on the entire situation just shifts accordingly. That is a sight to see.
So Muv-Luv Alternative, it doesn't go too deep into the whole fighting against fate part, but it does. It's a critical aspect, and I did appreciate seeing that when I read Alternative.
Now, going back to the definition of introducing Destiny early. So the one you defined at the start of this podcast episode, I brought up the inspiration for this episode. So I've recently read Data Alive Then Dystopia. And this is a title that is a canonical fan disc / spin-off. It is canonical, this is important. That tells the tale of characters being stuck in a looping world in which they have to make wishes to, a monkey paw style of deal. Okay? And throughout that looped experience, you get access to the new character. She gets her own road. Oddly enough, she is available very early on. She's not the final true ending. I mean, she is, but she doesn't need to be. Can I say it? Her own route isn't the true one, but clearing all other routes will enable continuation that will collapse into a true route solution to all of that.
Quantum
now,
routes.
Very early on, yeah, exactly. Early on in her regular route, let's call it like that, she tells the prophecy or maybe a story, and it is shaped up to be. If you've ever only watched the anime, and if you ever only experienced the previous VNs from the series, you don't really know what she's talking about. And in a lot of parallels, the story mirrors what happened in the very first episode of the series. But she is in fact not talking about that, and that's a slight misdirection, because she's trying to tell you the story of how it all began. And only by reading the books and or the final season and the anime that probably aired after the game, you'll get the full picture. And it's so interesting, especially given the fact that I've read everything prior to playing the game. I immediately understood, wait, that is deliberate misdirection for you to focus on the wrong thing, but at the same time, seeing that pattern repeat, you need to contemplate, where is this heading?
Interesting. You don't know where it's heading?
I mean, you wonder where it's heading this time, for example.
This time, as opposed to, I guess you could say, an endless time loop sort of thing?
In a way.
Ooh.
Obviously, I don't want to give too much away, but the fact that they specifically try to obfuscate what this is about and paint it as much as possible and as closely as possible to the original first episode of the anime to misdirect the audience. I felt like, wait, that's clever. I like that.
Oh boy, I always get bad memories about that sort of thing, because I remember Melancholy of Haruhi with their endless 8 episodes.
No. So I've heard. I've never watched it, but so I've heard the dreadful stories.
Oh dear, yes. I mean, I guess that means it was very effective, in a way, in a sense. And I hope Date to Live is left you with much sweeter impressions.
I mean, you are focusing too much on the Groundhog Day loops. That was not the point. The point was there was a series of events that happened in the past that she is referencing, but maybe that's not the first instance of the same events. That doesn't need to mean that they keep looping, but rather if that led to disaster before and now is the second iteration, don't let it to go to the disaster, okay?
In the sense that, these same things happened before and it resulted like this. Yes. And so if something very similar happens the same way again, we're going to get the same outcome.
Yeah.
And in a sense, that's its own, not really a prophecy, but still, it's the future. It's the cause and effect.
Yeah.
And so what are you going to do about it? Knowing that things are shaping up to resolve this way, Mr. Main Character, are you just going to let it happen, or how are you going to stop it?
Yes, it's very interesting, and you see the patterns of all that unfolding. Now, just to be again careful with the spoiler, funnier still, there's one of the routes from other characters in which that character makes a wish that invalidates the first instance of that prophecy. And funny enough, they actually did it and realized how it would be in this world. And me reading that and watching that, I was like, whoa. I was floored. That was very well done.
Mm-hmm. You are fighting that prophecy after all. You're gonna quit playing defense. Take the fight to them. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's always funny. Okay, interesting.
Yeah, it was a very, again, for something that has has that vibe of a final send-off, because I do believe this is the last entry in the Data Life franchise that the author was working on, and had that feeling of final send-off and a letter to fans, and still being part of the canon. I felt like showing all those different what ifs and how would's of world and alternatives felt really wholesome to see realized.
That's very cool. Glad you liked it.
It's not a title I could easily recommend for newbies and people unacquainted with the series, but for the true fans, it's a treat.
That's certainly a story about setting its own fate, huh?
Exactly, yeah.
But back on that track, though. For me, I also want to mention Never 7. Another one that somewhat involves a time loop aspect instead of the whole prophecy angle. Specifically in this one, the main character is a college student on a field trip to some resort. He has a weird dream of a corpse holding a tiny bell in her lifeless hand, but he doesn't know what she looks like. And the main character just writes this off as a weird dream, but as they all stay for the week, he gets visions of like what's about to happen in the future, like 10 seconds right before they happen. And eventually, he can't just convince himself that these are just some weird coincidences or something's going on with his head. He is definitely seeing the future right before it happens. And thus, he realizes that weird dream he had at the start of the week, that must have been its own prophecy. At some point, one of the women on the island is going to die with that bell in her hand. And so he realizes he's the only one he can prevent this. And it's up to him to fight his fate, to fight these weird visions he's having. And it's another example of fighting against fate. Because in this case, there's no real clear path to victory, I guess you could say. All he knows is that there's some weird bell involved, but the whole cause of death could be anything. Heck, he doesn't even know who the victim is. He's dreadfully underprepared for this, and he has no clue what he's doing. And so, for quite a bit of the visual novel, it's him on the desert resort, just keeping an eye out and enjoying the slice of life antics with the other characters.
So basically, it's less of a concrete prophecy, but rather a dreadful omen hanging like a sword of Damocles, right?
He's convinced it's coming. And so that's...
yeah.
Of course, because again, he doesn't have any proof. The whole time he's
Yes.
kind of wondering, kind of hoping that this was just one sick dream he had, and it's not actually going to happen. But of course, as the events play out, as he gets more unsure of himself, it's building towards the end of their 7-day trip. And that's one thing I like about the endings, is that this is multiple choice, and it's nothing too much, but there are bad endings and there are the true endings. And it's safe to say that the bad endings do result in him seeing that same vision he prophesized at the beginning of the week. He's like, oh no, her lifeless hand and that bell. Oh, how could this happen? And then it's the bad ending in the credits.
And that example of, how can I say it, confirming fears and seeing bad ends for the prophecy reminded me, and just a slight detour, that a similar narrative structure was in Steins Gate, in which you, in order to reach the solution, you had to reach the bad ending to understand the problem. And I felt like that was super clever. And you're referencing now that maybe there is a pathway in Never 7 in which you will see how that omen transpires into an event.
I really wish I had read Steins Gate before this episode, because I feel like that would have been a real rich VN to talk about and all of this on the time travel aspects. But
True.
We do have Never 7, and this is more so in the sense of knowing something is coming and trying to fight your fate as hard as you can. And I like the multiple endings too, because there are multiple heroines. There's a lot of different ways the story can branch out. And some of the heroine routes get a little more interesting than others in how this supposed prophecy is resolved. Whether it's very dramatic and played straight for the character drama, or whether it's fighting back, or whether there's some very funny complications involved. There's a lot of characters, and they all give a little unique wrinkle to how it's approached. It's very interesting. And of course, there's a few twist aspects of Never 7 that really kind of flip this prophecy thing on its head.
I mean, the number one fact, listening to you and not knowing the title, just because of that omen is so open-ended, grants the ability of what if that was never about a singular character, but rather it's a fight undetermined and you don't know who. Right? That's number one thing that a fear that goes to my mind. It's not that far detached from a title I've referenced some time ago when we talked about Monster Girls. And Princess X had also a flashback sequence in which you saw a promise being made to a character, and it just so happens multiple characters have the same pose. So it obfuscates who that truly was.
Exactly. Like you were mentioning how it's a CG of that character making the promise, and it's an incredibly blurry, vague outline of that character. And then it's like, oh, it was her. Or it's like the character whose route I'm on. And then you get on a different route and it's
Exactly.
like, oh, it's her, the character whose route I'm on. Yeah,
exactly. It was so funny.
Same here in Never 7. Like at face value, it's like, oh, it's the character whose route I'm on. Oh no, it's her, the one who's in danger. I have to save her, specifically her.
How convenient.
How very convenient. It's almost as if this saves the visual novel artists a lot of time and effort.
Oh, true. All they need to draw is an arm as a hook And then we'll figure out everything later, okay?
There we go. And it cuts out. We are only zoomed in on the hand. It cuts off past the arm. Could be anyone.
Yeah, exactly.
No identifying
Anyone.
clothes or anything. Wouldn't you know it?
The only clue you get is those are the handers, people with hands, okay?
Yes, people with hands. Very, very critical.
They are very handy.
But yeah, I love that in Never 7, it gave us a whole, I guess, deadline of impending action that needs to be taken. And how the closer you got to that last 7th day, you knew the plot was picking up more. I always like stories that have a very focused central plot. I like to know where we're going, how things are developing, and in a sense getting railroaded. I guess that's the negative way to put it, but that sort of feeling.
Okay.
And even though Never 7 sure took its time in some places with really long and repetitive scenes, there was that end goal of the prophecy it had to go to. And the main character fighting it the whole while also gave a lot of interesting... it gave a lot of spark to the character and the plot. So all in all, I'm always happy to see these kinds of man versus fate conflicts in visual novels. I always like the various ways they can be taken.
Exactly. I feel like it set up the moment of clash, the final moment when the journey of going against the destiny has to confront, like whether or not you will bend or will you not bend. I think that's how it. I think that's the one thing that they set up very neatly and keep you engaged.
Hooray! Yes, lots of good stuff. Lots of good stuff. Thanks for also explaining those other titles to me, Amar. Very informative.
And with that, I think we reached an end. So in my future, I predict this is the end of the episode, and all our listeners now enjoyed the video. So thanks all listeners, and with that, venture out.
Venture out.